The last thing that I would want to say to somebody is the reason that you're suffering is because you've done something wrong. If you disconnect from God, if you disconnect from healthy spiritual life following Jesus, that's going to have a detrimental effect on our well-being as a whole. So many people are longing to flourish, but they're living in the sphere of suffering.
Welcome to the Thrive College podcast. This is the official launch of season 2, which, hey-o, I am so excited about because the first thing we did as we were brainstorming what we wanted season 2 to look at is we actually sat down with our current group of students, which it's a new year in Thrive College and we have a brand new group of students. So we sat down with them and many of them had listened to the podcast and we asked the question, what do we want out of season 2? And one of the amazing ideas they came up with is they said, hey, we feel like there are certain barriers or questions that we have that consistently keep us from feeling prepared for our calling. And we'd love to do a deep dive into those areas to feel better prepared for our calling. And I thought, that's incredible. So this year, we're actually going to be doing 4 mini seasons. And each mini season, we're going to deep dive into a particular topic that will help us prepare for our calling. And the very first one was like, no joke, it was everyone's pick. It was the battle for mental health. So this is season 2, Thrive College podcast, the battle for mental health. And it was a no-brainer for us because it feels like the thing that everyone is battling. It's something where, like, who do you even ask for advice on this? You can go to your parents and they're like, we're in the middle of this. You go to your grandparents and they're like, I'm not sure this is real. It's really hard to find great biblical advice on how to battle well for your mental health. And so that's why we're going to do a deep dive. And so for our first episode of season 2, we've brought in Matt. So Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Matt Hochstetter. I'm a second-year Thrive College student, and I currently intern with our global special needs team, Safe Harbor.
Love it. Okay.
Amazing.
Now tell us one interesting factoid about yourself in high school.
About myself in high school?
Yes. He's so humble. He doesn't really talk about himself often,
Gosh.
so I'm pushing this.
See, this is a question that I never know how to answer because I was like the most boring kid in all of high school.
That can be your fact.
It could, maybe I am the number one most boring kid in all of America
Oh my goodness.
for a year.
I really doubt it. I'm going to need to see like a picture and you need to come back to the podcast with like a very crazy epic story.
Oh
Can you
gosh.
go ask your parents, when was the most epic moment of my high school years?
I bet they know something. I'll have to get back to you on that.
That's not a great bio. The most boring kid ever. You're
boring
not
kid ever.
boring. I've been hanging out with you for the last 10 minutes. You're amazing, Matt.
That's right.
Thank you.
Love
I appreciate that.
And the other voice that you hear is Wesley Towne. So Pastor Wesley pastors at our Bayside Davis campus, which if you don't know UC Davis, it is a town that is literally pretty much college students.
Yep,
Tell us
pretty
how
much
many
college
students live there?
40,000 college students in a city of 67,000 people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
primarily very, very young.
Yes, and it's very diverse. And when it comes to the topic of mental health, this is something that you pastor yourself as well as students daily through. And in addition to that, the reason we wanted to bring you onto the show and help us to know how to battle for our mental health is that you run the Better Days Ahead podcast. So give us a little bit of info about that podcast in general, because man, we're going to do 6 episodes on this, but that is just going to, get us started in understanding how to do this area of our life well.
Yeah, amazing. First of all, great to be with both of you. How cool that you guys are doing this as part of Thrive College to reach students and give them a platform to ask questions and really develop the future of communication around things like podcasting. It's an absolute honor to be here to talk about mental health. So again, my name is Wesley Towne. I'm a pastor, but also I'm very passionate and involved in the mental health conversation. I started an organization called Better Days, and we do a bunch of different things. But one of the things that we do is we podcast about all things mental health and suffering, specifically within the vein of how does this intersect with following Jesus, the life of a Christian, leaders who are struggling. We started that in 2019, a little podcast, had no idea what was going to come about through doing a podcast. And now we just have the privilege of reaching so many people in our country and around the world through this conversation that, as you guys know, is one of the top conversations in our culture today.
Mm-hmm.
People are either struggling with their mental health or they know somebody who is struggling and they're trying to find answers. And for so long within Christianity, there has been a vacuum of conversation around mental health and suffering and how that intersects with following Jesus. So we thought, because there's a gap and it's such a huge part of my story, my life, that we could be a voice in this discussion to help pioneer this conversation in Christianity and really help people see it, not only from a practical point of view, but also from a deeply theological point of view.
I love that. That's so helpful. And I know, literally getting ready in the morning, I listen to episodes from the Better Days Ahead podcast, and I'm just wondering, like, okay, what is going on in people's life that this has become such a battle for them? So I know for myself, I have my own journey with mental health. And if you're listening and you're thinking, wow, I'm just kind of showing up a little bit new to this conversation, don't worry. You can catch up in this conversation, and there is so much hope and there's so much help out there. So definitely tune in for all episodes. Love what you're doing, and so grateful you're here today.
Yes, me too.
Yeah.
Well, on the Thrive College podcast, we're all about preparing the next generation for their calling. And so, Matt, I want to turn the mic over to you. What question do you want to get us started with?
Yeah, for sure. You just mentioned it earlier. Mental health is so complicated. And nowadays, we kind of just say mental health, and it's like a catch-all for so many things. So just to get us started before we even take off, can you just define for us, as best as you can, what is mental health?
Yeah, I think at the base level, mental health is our well-being, like overall entirety of what it means to be human. So oftentimes when we use the term mental health, we're just thinking about our mind, but our mental health is our well-being mentally, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. And you have to add in the fourth facet, because we believe that's the foundation for all of life. If you disconnect from God, if you disconnect from healthy spiritual life following Jesus, that's going to have a detrimental effect on our well-being as a whole, since well-being essentially is functioning as God designed us to function. So I think when we use the term mental health, we're using it in culture and in the church also in two ways. First is, when we think about mental health, we're thinking about the positive side is our flourishing. Like, what does it look like to be healthy and well and thriving and flourishing as a human being and follower of Jesus?
Yeah.
What can we do to invest in that? What are the different areas of us in our life that maybe we're living in deficit, or we feel unhealthy, or we're not intentionally investing in? And then the other side of mental health, one side is flourishing, the other side is suffering. And I think this is how we use this term most often in culture. We use the term mental health in the sense that there's so many people suffering. Not a lot of people are talking about mental health on the flourishing end, although that has become a dominant part of the discussion recently, which I think is really good. But so many people are struggling. The statistics around mental health challenges in your generation are alarming in some sense. There's a brand new study that just came out this year. It's from 2022, but this year around college students. And over 60% of college students in one study were dealing with mental health conditions, like clinical mental health conditions. Another study also just came out that 90% of high schoolers and college students are dealing with a mental health condition.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, so many people are longing to flourish, but they're living in the sphere of suffering.
Yeah.
They're saying, I am struggling with anxiety or depression or burnout or some aspect of a mental health challenge in their life. So I think it's so important that not only we understand the basic definition, which can lead us to a place of health and flourishing and actually knowing how to navigate this in our own life, but we also understand that there's two sides of this. Like, there's this flourishing end and then there's this suffering end, and both are a part of the mental health conversation and definition.
Okay, so let's zone in on one of those things that you talked about. You talked about it is your mental health, but also your emotional, your social, and your spiritual health. So many people are in seasons of great health and in seasons of suffering. As someone who has studied mental health and college students and so many people and who has mental health yourself, where do you find like spirituality in that? And when we have a relationship with God, and then we still go through these mental health struggles, these periods of depression and anxiety and stress and guilt, where is God in all that? Like if someone is going through a rough patch with their mental and spiritual health, does that mean that God's not there? I would like to think he is, but if he is, where is he in all that?
Yeah, great question.
That's a super easy question, right,
Yeah.
Wesley? Just
I think
tee
there's-
you up for one of the hardest.
There's a few layers to your question.
It's a great question, Matt.
Such a good question. I think first and foremost, understanding the intersection between God and our mental health is really important. And you asked a question like, what is spiritual in this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Every part of what it means to be human. And what I mean by that is how God originally designed us. Genesis 1 and 2. He designed us as spiritual beings, right? And we use that idea usually, the idea and definition or the way to elucidate that is we're meant to be in a relationship with God. But God also created us as people that have a mind, people that have emotions, people that have bodies. We are an embodied soul. So you have all these immaterial parts of you, but you also have a material part of you. Everything that God designed for us to be humans is spiritual. So spiritual isn't just talking to Jesus in the morning or praying. Spiritual is stewarding our mind, our thought life, the healthy thought patterns and negative thought patterns, what we think about, what we allow our mind to be inundated with, but also how we process our emotions, being able to feel and manage our emotions in a healthy way, being able to process things that happen in life in a healthy way, that we don't get stuck in suppressing or evading or running from different emotions that might be incited in the hard points of life. Also means that we steward our relational side, like that social side. And that has many different spheres. It might be our family of origin. It might be somebody that we're dating. It might be our community. And it also, we're affected by another sphere in the relational side of mental health is our society as a whole. Like what happens in our culture affects us positively and negatively. We saw that during the pandemic. We're seeing that with all the current wars that are happening, the amount of stress that we feel. Sometimes we're not even aware of that stress, that we're noticing all of these negative narratives are affecting our mind, our body, our soul, our emotions, and then stewarding our body. Like we are an embodied being. Everything that we feel and think and our relational capacity to connect with other human beings in healthy and unhealthy ways, that is housed in a body. So I think all of that is spiritual. And I think having a holistic idea of, as a disciple of Jesus, I'm not just living to thrive in praying and reading my Bible. I'm also living to thrive in every part of what God created.
Yeah.
All of those facets of human life. So taking that idea to your kind of the second part of your question is like, oh, well, we're seeing all of this widespread, replete suffering in this world. We're seeing so many people, including ourselves, deal with depression, anxiety, and trauma, and so on and so forth. Where is God in that? I think that is a really important question, and I've actually thought quite a bit about that particular question. I think that somebody I heard recently said this. They said, if you take God out of existence, if we just say there's no God, will there still be human suffering? And the answer is yes. Like, there is a responsibility on the human end for the suffering that we experience for all of human history. So the way that I like to frame it is, in Genesis 1 and 2, you see flourishing. You see all of creation and every life form functioning just as God intended it. In all of the goodness, God's summation of his creation is everything was very good. And post-Genesis 3, you see flourishing. Post-Genesis 3, you see the human history and the storyline of suffering, because human beings walked away from God's good design and they chose to live contrary to God's boundary. God's boundary was, hey, everything that I'm giving you is for your blessing and you're flourishing and it's good and it's going to cause you to thrive as human beings. Thrive. And outside of this, if you do this one thing, here's this one boundary.
Yeah.
If you cross this line, you're choosing to live autonomously away from me. You're choosing to live my authority, but also leave my good design. And once you do that, you're going to subvert and mar what I designed in this good creation. And so I think post Genesis 3, you see the entire story of the Bible is the undoing of God's good design. And God's not at fault for that. I think it's so interesting that we always blame God for suffering. It's like, God, why is this all this suffering in the world? Where if we have a really healthy narrative of human history from the Bible, we realize, no, God actually did not create the suffering. God created the goodness. We chose to do what was contrary to God's goodness, and suffering as a result ensued across creation. And so I think you see flourishing, but then on the third part of this is you have flourishing, you have suffering, but then you also have Jesus. And in Jesus, we have understanding and redemption. Like think about this, the very pinnacle of what we believe to be human history was the Son of God suffering. And it was through his suffering that we could be redeemed and ultimately healed from our suffering. So that's the heart of the gospel. The heart of the gospel is human beings are suffering. So God chose to suffer to redeem us from our bad decisions and our disconnection from him, but also he chose to heal us, and we'll feel that culmination someday. So I wouldn't say God is at fault. We're at fault. And God is pursuing us to heal us and redeem us and ultimately bring us back into that good design where all suffering will be literally non-existent for all of eternity. And to me, that's just the most beautiful narrative.
I think that's so helpful. I'm the whole time you were talking, I was visualizing someone, maybe a high schooler, listening, and they woke up and it's a Tuesday and they just woke up depressed. Like they have absolutely no motivation for anything. And they're really accusing themselves, and they're just feeling like so full of shame, and they don't like themselves right now. They don't like the world they're living in. Everything feels so dark. And into that Tuesday, there's that question, where is God? And what I love about your answer is you said, man, it's so easy to blame God, but that's only because we're not aware of the full story, is that God created things good. We humans have strayed from what is good. And to that person listening who's struggling with a mental health battle, it's not necessarily your sin that has caused your anxiety, caused your depression, but the world that we're living in has created the conditions that have led to that anxiety and depression. And sometimes our sin does cause, and sometimes our sin does even not cause, but make it worse. But God doesn't leave us in that chapter of the story. He sent his son to save us and to be with us and to love us. And so I feel like that's so helpful to take us out of the darkness of our story and lift our eyes to the greater biblical story to know that's where God is. He's in this whole story, every page of it, and every page of your story. That's so helpful, Wesley.
Yeah. And to be honest, Wesley, that really speaks to my personal experience fighting. Like this series is like the war on mental health, the battle for mental health. And I had to fight my demons and my depression for 3 years. And it finally, I moved out of that season when I was able to fully reconcile, like, me with Jesus and fully realize that gifting or that gift that's been given to me, that is relationship with him and my identity as a son of him. But in that season before I came to that conclusion, when I was just dwelling in my own sin and I didn't know the way out, there's such a tension there for someone who's stuck in that place, because you don't quite get the reality of what Jesus did for you on the cross. In the moment, you're only thinking about your own sin. And you said that, like, sometimes this, and Dina, you said this too, sometimes the problems that we face are caused by our own sin. So as someone is stuck in that sin, as they are experiencing the symptoms of whatever's causing them to have this mental illness that they go through, how do you like, how do you recognize that it is your sin that has caused this, at least in part, without making that an indictment on yourself? Like, this is your fault and you're wrong, you're bad, you're a bad boy for bringing this on yourself. How can you healthily understand, hey, I have to take some responsibility for this so that I can fully appreciate Jesus sacrificing himself for a sinful man? How can you understand and fully process, like, this was, at least in part, my fault, without just completely dumping on yourself and getting so in your own head about that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think when I am using the idea of sin affecting the world and bringing suffering, I'm not saying everybody who's suffering from mental health has a primary responsibility based on choices that they're making that is causing them their mental health condition.
Right.
I'm saying, as a world history narrative, human beings decided to walk away from God's goodness and design. And the natural result of that is this undoing, this marring of what God intended for this world. And that incrementally permeates human history to cause every part of creation, plant life, animal life, ocean, human beings, so on and so forth, to feel the effects of life apart from God's design, which means there's things that aren't good. There's things that are hard and tough and pain and suffering. So I would say to the person who's processing through their mental health, there could be so many different causes for a mental health condition. I think it's dangerous for us to say, oh, the reason that we're all dealing with mental health is because of sin that we're committing. I think from a meta narrative, yes, that caused this undoing. But part of the reason that we deal with mental health is that we live in this post-Genesis 3 reality where human suffering is everywhere, where we all experience this. This is Paul's argument in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 is this whole narrative of how God transforms our life through the Spirit. And a major chunk of that is, okay, but we're suffering too. Like, how does this part of our Christian life, how do we process through this? How do we walk with Jesus in the midst of this? And he talks about two realities. One is our present suffering, and two is our future hope. But in the midst of our present suffering, he says, and we all groan along with creation, awaiting the redemption of our bodies, the renewal. He uses all of these phrases for a future hope. In the midst of that, it's just hard. Life can be hard. Human suffering does not play favorites. We all experience it. We all feel it. And the last thing that I would want to say to somebody is the reason that you're suffering is because you've done something wrong. That was Job's friend's answer.
Right?
And God rebuked Job's friends because they were awful friends in the midst of suffering. I think that the wise thing for us to say is, I am so sorry that you're suffering. I have no idea what is behind it, what is causing it, but I love you and I care about you, and I want to understand your unique narrative of suffering. I want to understand what you're going through from your perspective and lean into that with gentleness and care and love. I think sometimes we're too quick to give answers and solutions. We need to be quicker to respond in a healthy way to what a person needs in the midst of their suffering. So I'm really careful from using the phrase sin in connection with mental health. Certainly, we can make bad personal decisions that would be in this category. I define sin, I think it's a really conceptual idea of life contrary to God's design. So life outside of God's nature, who he is as a person, life outside of God's design, what he created and designed for this world to be and function and thrive and flourish. So I think that we've got to be really careful from saying you're the primary cause. The secondary cause might be just we live in a world of suffering. Yeah. There's evil, there's pain, there's fractured relationships, there's drama and stress and things in society that affect us. There's digital devices that are good and they're bad. They cause relational connection, but they also cause mental health harm. We just live in this space and space and place where we feel the effects of suffering, and the causes could be so replete and varied based on each individual story and circumstance that we just have to be really wise in how we approach like cause and people taking responsibility.
So good. I want to wrap up our conversation. This is just the first of a series of conversations we get to have with Wesley about mental health. But we started with the question of why is this such a battle? And you gave us some great information about what's going on in our world. And then you pointed us to, and really challenged us to immerse ourselves in the biblical narrative, to know and to know and to know what is going on in the world as told by the Bible. So if you've not yet opened Genesis 1 and read all of Genesis and then flip forward to Revelation, read Genesis, read Revelation. And one of the things you'll walk away from that experience with is just this sense that God is indeed good. His intentions towards humanity are good, like you're saying, Wesley. And then there's the everything in between, which we're wrestling with now. That is the battle for mental health, is the everything in between. And in the midst of the in between, I actually love what you said, Matt, in terms of so nuanced, Wesley. We have to be very careful not to assign blame.
Yeah.
But maybe there is a place for allowing the Holy Spirit to sift our heart and to say, as you are groaning and agonizing about what is going on in your world, is there a place for you to own the brokenness in your life that has contributed to the brokenness in the world? Because we're all part of that story. And yeah, go ahead, Matt.
And when you to be able to do that, it helps so much to have people you can trust to do that with you, friends and mentors who won't look at you and say, yeah, it was your fault, blame yourself, who are willing to approach you in the way that you just described. Like having a community, a church community, a friend community, friends, family, and parents that can help you to do that is critical, so critical.
Yes, I love that, because I think part of the story you're sharing is maybe you were a little too prone to beat up on yourself, took some family members to pull you out of that and to say, this is yours to own. This is not yours to own. You don't own all of the brokenness, like Wesley is saying. And then just in the in-between to really look at our suffering and say, Jesus is with me in the midst of it. So if you're showing up to this conversation about mental health, if you're dealing with depression, anxiety, relational wounds, any of the things that come with the battle for mental health, I want you to start there. Start by immersing yourself in the biblical narrative and know that Jesus is no stranger to what you're walking through. He's been there himself and he will guide you through it. Any closing thoughts, Wesley?
You guys are amazing.
Aww.
Love being on the Thrive College podcast with this amazing crew.
Perfect. Well, tune in to our next episode. We're going to dive into a little bit more practical, tangible, what is bad for mental health and what really helps our mental health. Thank you so much.